Now, someone's going to watch this video and immediately say, Richard, you're just lazy and you want to work in your pajamas. And to that person, you're not entirely wrong. But here's the thing. That argument, the pajamas argument, is exactly why this entire debate is broken. Because we're not talking about whether people are comfortable. We're talking about where value actually gets generated. And those are two very different conversations. I've watched businesses defend 5 days in the office mandates while their employees sit in back-to-back meetings all day, do zero actual work, and then go home and finish the job at midnight. And somehow the office is meant to be the productive environment. Today, we're going to pull this apart properly. No corporate spin, no LinkedIn thought leadership fluff. Just the argument as it actually stands. My name is Richard and welcome to Ron's Industries, where we're pro-wealth, pro-growth and pro-business. And in this video, we're looking at the remote work productivity debate and why the office versus home argument is missing the point entirely. Right, so let's set the scene for a moment. If you've spent any time watching business content online lately, or sitting in a boardroom just reading the news, or simply paying attention to the workday, you know this debate is everywhere. Remote work, return to office, hybrid, 4-day weeks. Everyone's got a hot take on this. And what struck me, what actually prompted this whole conversation, was watching one of those 60-minute style segments where they've rounded up a few different business owners to present their points of view. And what I noticed was this. Not any single person won me over. Every single person in that segment was arguing from their own specific experience, their own model, through their own lens. You had a solo practice lawyer, you had a guy running a solar energy reseller out of what looked like the world's smallest office, you had a travel company CEO, and you had an entrepreneur. Every single one of them was treating their situation as if it were the universal truth. Now, here's the thing I want to establish before we go any further. The remote work debate is not one debate. It's at least 4 or 5 different debates that we keep mashing together and then wondering why no one agrees. Because, look, the storeman physically has to be at the warehouse. The technician needs access to equipment. The mechanic can't diagnose your car over Zoom. There are rules where physical presence is genuinely non-negotiable. That's not the argument. The argument is about the vast middle ground, the knowledge workers, the digital roles, the people whose entire job lives on a screen, and whether forcing them into an office 5 days a week is actually producing better outcomes or just producing the appearance of better outcomes for people who need to see bums in seats before they feel they're getting their money's worth. Those are two different things. Now, here's what the return to office cheerleaders consistently refuse to acknowledge. The workload being placed on employees today is categorically higher than it was a generation ago. And I'm not talking about a marginal increase. I'm talking about fundamental shifts in what businesses expect out of a person in exchange for a salary. You're asking people to commute potentially 2 to 3 hours a day, and that's just the round trip. We're asking them to sit in back-to-back meetings. You're asking them to be constantly available, constantly tapped in and connected, notified and alerted, to operate and pay attention to noise, constantly performing productivity for whoever was watching. And then at the end of all that, you're expecting them to actually do the work. So where and when? Apparently in the gaps between everything else, or at 10 p.m. on a weekend. Here's a useful analogy. Think about how you treat your car. A high-performance engine needs maintenance, oil changes, cool down, scheduled servicing. You know what happens when you run it hard without any of that? It deteriorates, parts fail, and eventually it stops. Human beings are exactly the same, except unlike a car, a person can quit, or burn out, or go on extended psychological leave, or get sick repeatedly. And if you actually pull the data on sick days, mental health leave, and the turnover rates in businesses that run their people on 5 days a week, the always on model versus businesses that offer genuine flexibility, the numbers aren't going to flatter the office first crowd. The corporations that insist on maximum in-person time often aren't doing it because it produces better results. They're doing it because it produces the feeling of control. And they will just keep replacing the people who fall over because to them, you're a resource. You're not an asset. And that difference really, really matters. So let me tell you what actually happens in a modern open plan office. You arrive, you get settled, someone immediately starts a Teams call 3 meters from your desk and apparently hasn't discovered the concept of headphones. Two people start debating a strategy issue at full volume, someone else's phone rings, they transfer it to their mobile and walk outside because obviously a phone call doesn't work in an open plan environment. Then there's another call that isn't work related, where everyone can hear someone say, "Sure, I can talk. Can you give me a minute to go somewhere quiet?" You put your headphones on and you try to focus. By 10 a.m., you've done approximately 45 minutes of real work, received 14 notifications, barely touched a weekend's of emails, and you've been at your desk since 8:30. Now, here's the irony that no one talks about. The people who go to the office and actually need to get focused work done, what do? They put on headphones, they face the wall, they essentially recreate a private workspace inside the shared space, which raises a genuinely obvious question. If you're doing everything possible to pretend you're not in the office while you're in the office, what exactly is the office for? And then there's the global dimension. In most companies of any meaningful size, your colleagues aren't all in the same building anyway. They're in different cities, they're in different countries, and also different time zones. You communicate with them the same way, regardless of whether you're sitting through a Teams meeting, Slack, email, or Zoom. Geography has already stopped mattering for most collaborative work. The office as a hub for collaborative argument made sense in 1995 when the alternative was a fax machine. But here's the thing, it's not 1995 anymore. All right, so this is the argument that tends to cut through with business owners who are actually serious about growth rather than defending their own preferences. When you mandate 5 days in office attendance, you're making a conscious decision to shrink your hiring pool. And I'm talking dramatically. Think about it. Your viable candidates are now limited to people who can commute to within realistically about 20 kilometers of your office. Factor in average traffic speeds, parking costs, and travel time, and that is your universe. That's who you're choosing from. The best candidate for your role might live in a different city, potentially a different state, or even a different country, and they're not moving for you, especially not in a market where your competitors, the ones who've figured this out, are advertising remote first positions and suddenly have access to national or even global talent. You've handed them an enormous advantage, and you've done it because you want to be able to physically see your people. Let that sink in. There's also the cost dimension. If you hire remotely, you can access talent in regions with lower costs of living, pay them a salary that genuinely supports their lifestyle in that region, and potentially do so at a more competitive rate than hiring locally in a major city where you can't find talent. That's not exploitation, that's how global labor markets function. The caveat, and it matters, you actually have to pay them enough to live well where they are. Trying to hire a senior developer in Eastern Europe at intern rates is both unethical and spectacularly stupid, because the good ones know their market value and they will laugh at you and take the next offer. But when it's done properly, your talent pool stops being the 20 kilometers around your postcode, it becomes the planet. Now, I want to be careful here because I've seen this debate go too far in the other direction as well, where everyone just assumes remote work is universally better for everyone. And I don't think it is. And pretending otherwise is just the other side of the same bad argument. Some people genuinely don't function well remotely and they simply don't like it. They know it about themselves. They need to have that structure of physically going somewhere, the social rhythm of colleagues around them, the clear separation between work mode and home mode. That's a completely legitimate preference. And those people should absolutely have the access to the office time that they need. Some roles genuinely require physical presence, and we're talking about all those known jobs like production, logistics, anything involving physical equipment or in person service delivery. The argument isn't that offices are bad. The argument is that mandatory attendance for roles that don't require it, enforced across the board, is a blunt instrument being used to solve a management problem. And the real management problem, let's name it, is that some managers don't know how to manage outcomes. They can only manage visibility. If they can see you at your desk, they feel like they're in control. If they can't see you, they panic, they question. That's not a remote work problem. That's a management maturity issue. Now, here's the most outdated idea in this entire conversation: the 40-hour work week as a proxy for productivity. Let me give you a scenario. Two people, same task. One finishes it in 3 hours and it's good work. The other spends 8 hours on it because that's what they've got. It's also good work, but it still takes them 8 hours. Under a time and presence model, the person who took 8 hours looks more productive. Now, they were at their desk longer. The manager could see them. They looked busy. The person who finished in 3 hours looked like they're slacking off or potentially cutting corners. This is an insane way to run a business, and we haven't even discussed the downsides of being overly effective. The question any serious employer should be asking isn't how long were you at your desk, it's did the work get done? Is it good and did it land on time? Deadlines are non-negotiable. Quality is non-negotiable. That's your brand. The hours are a legacy metric on a payslip. Now, digital entrepreneurs know this. Genuinely motivated self-starters know this. High performers know exactly how some of the best mental work happens when there's time, space, and the freedom to think, often at times where one simply shouldn't be working, not when they need to conveniently pull out a new marketing strategy in the 18 minutes they have before their scheduled and scripted lunch break. And while we're here, if you've installed software to monitor your remote employees' keystrokes and track their screen activity or log how long they've been idle, I've got news for you. That's not a productive strategy. That's a trust breakdown dressed up as technology. And if you've reached the point where you need to put surveillance on your own people to feel like they're working, the issue isn't remote work. The issue is either your hiring process, your culture, or your own management approach, possibly even all three. Now, this is where I want to be genuinely careful because I think both the legislated and the never legislated camps make real mistakes. The argument for some minimum policy flaw, say giving employees a right to a certain number of remote days, is that it creates a baseline that protects workers from the worst employers. And there are a lot of worst employers. There are the ones who run people hard and replace them when they break. There's chronic micromanagers, the high turnover operators who've built their entire model around the assumption that they can keep squeezing and keep hiring. A minimum standard forces them to adapt or lose people to businesses that have already figured it out. It can also tip these micromanagers the other way into even more dangerous and paranoid territory. There's also the second order economic argument that I find genuinely compelling here. When workers don't commute into central business districts every day, spending happens locally. The cafe near their home gets the coffee order, the local shop gets the lunch traffic, local economies in suburban and regional areas benefit. Meanwhile, CBDs that are already commercially overdeveloped will readjust. Melbourne's commercial vacancy rate is a data point worth examining if you want concrete examples of what happens when a city's entire economic model is built around mandatory office density. But here's the counter argument, and I think it's a fair one. Policy is fundamentally blunt. A rule that makes sense for a digital marketing agency might genuinely not work, probably won't work, for a physiotherapy practice, a manufacturing plant, or a restaurant. The principle I'd land on is this: the decision should sit with the employer and the employee, shaped by the nature of the work and the culture of the organization, not dictated from above and not dictated entirely by whoever has more leverage in the relationship, which has historically been the employer. Now, here's the thing. COVID didn't create remote work. It forced the world's largest involuntary experiment in remote work. Overnight, businesses that had spent decades insisting that offices were essential discovered that a huge portion of their work operations could function perfectly well from people's kitchens and spare bedrooms. Geography stopped mattering, and once you've seen that, once you've lived it, you can't unsee it. Now, layer on top of that what's happening with artificial intelligence. The capital cost of starting a digital business is dropping. The tools available to small teams and solopreneurs are absolutely extraordinary. The barriers that used to require large offices and large staff headcounts are absolutely dissolving. And as that happens, remote first becomes not just the exception, but it becomes the default for an increasing proportion of new businesses that we're going to see in the future. The clock watchers aren't wrong that some work requires presence. What they're wrong about is the assumption that the presence equals value. It doesn't, and I don't think it ever did. It just used to be the only option we had. Deadlines are non-negotiable. The deliverable has to be delivered. But where it gets done and in what hours is a conversation worth having seriously, and not defaulting to the way things were done before laptops, broadband, and globalized economy changed the game entirely. The question isn't office or home. The question is, what does the work actually need, and who's the right person to do it? Everything else is just noise. If this has sparked something for you, if you're a business owner rethinking your model, or you're an employee navigating this conversation with your employer, I'd genuinely love to hear where you land on it. Drop that in the comments below. If you want to go deeper, the full written piece is linked in the description. It covers some of the nuance we haven't had time to go into here. And if you found this useful, do me a favor and subscribe. My name's Richard, this is Ronce Industries, where we're pro-wealth, pro-growth, and pro-business. I'm going to see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.